So again, thanks for the great conversations during the break. I know the speakers enjoy it, and you've got some very smart folks here in the room. The next panel and the next topic is not in the report itself, but appreciate that they recognize that it's a key player not only in Indiana agriculture, but also in the reduction opportunities. And so our goal here is to dive deeper into the area of renewable energy and the future of ethanol, bio-based diesel, and sustainable aviation fuels. Essentially addressing the other end of what we call climate-smart agriculture, with gasification providing the important pathway. There's energy potential, there's economic investment, and commercial application opportunities that are part of this are very significant. And we've got some great regional, local experts to join us on the panel. I am going to moderate this, and so I just honored, but also I don't want to screw up some really smart people. So I'll do the best I can to keep the questions going. So I'll hop down here now. All right, so we'll start with just the introductions and let each of the panelists cover not only their organization but their background and on the topic. And I'll start with one of the report's authors, Jerome.
Okay, again, thank you very much for being here. My name is Jerome Dumortier, and I'm a professor here at Indiana University in Indianapolis. So I'm a researcher, and I have been researching bioenergy and biofuels in particular over the last decade, so to say. I have started with the implications in terms of land use change of corn ethanol using global economic models. But then I moved into the more local aspects at the county level in the United States of various aspects related to biofuel production. So I'm an economist, but I'm using economic simulation models to basically analyze of what happens if you are changing biofuel production from various feedstocks in the United States, what happens to land use change, what happens to land allocation, and also what happens to commodity prices. I have basically I've been building my career on the growth of biofuels, of corn ethanol in particular. And then I have also expanded into the area of electric vehicles. And I think at some point I came to the realization that, well, if you're having more electric vehicles, then you're not using corn ethanol anymore. And so I was interested in, well, what happens to markets, to agricultural markets in the US when you suddenly have an increased number of electric vehicles? What are the implications for farmers, for farm income, etc.? And then recently I have started to expand into the area of sustainable aviation fuels. Because basically now the question is, when you're thinking about the long-term trajectory, or if you're thinking about the evolution over the years, you have multiple dynamics here. On one hand, you have the very slow decline of corn ethanol or gasoline demand because of electric vehicles. You also have the implications of sustainable aviation fuels. Then the question is, are we going to have the sustainable aviation fuels at the beginning on top of corn ethanol demand for road transportation, or is this going to be something in the long run? Also, what are going to be the feedstocks of sustainable aviation fuels? And that has been the area of my research, of my recent work.
And next, Madhu Khanna from the University of Illinois.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Madhu Khanna. I'm an environmental economist at the University of Illinois. I'm a professor there, and I'm also the director of the Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment at the university. I have also, like Jerome, working on biofuels since the Renewable Fuel Standard, which was about 15 plus years ago, and looking at both the potential to use corn and soybeans, but also a variety of different types of energy crops and corn crop residues, the economics of that, the land questions, where is the land available, which type of land will be used, and what are the greenhouse gas benefits and costs of doing that, as well as looking at the effectiveness of different types of energy policies that we have and different federal energy and climate policies. And then more recently have been interested in looking at this idea about climate smart agriculture and how that is intersecting with our interest in bioenergy and this interest also in carbon dioxide removal, both for food production, food crops, as well as fuel, and more recently have been transitioning into applying all of that, looking at the potential and the costs with for sustainable aviation fuel. So happy to be here today.
Thanks. Next, Doug Bervin from Poet.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, my name's Doug Bervin. I'm Vice President of Corporate Affairs for Poet. I've been with the company for about 22 years now. So all the way back pre-RFS days. It's been quite a ride. For those of you that aren't familiar with Poet, we are the largest biofuel producer in the world. We produce about 3 billion gallons of ethanol on an annual basis, about 14 billion pounds of distillers' grains that we ship all around the world, feed livestock. We produce about 5% of the CO2, 5% of the food grade CO2 in this country. We capture CO2 at about 13 of our plants, just a portion of that CO2, and sell it as dry ice or the bubbles in your soda or beer, all different types of food applications for CO2, so we already have the experience of capturing CO2. Let's see, we also produce about nearly 1 billion pounds of corn oil that goes into renewable diesel for the most part. We buy about 1 billion bushels of corn on an annual basis. That's about 7% of the U.S. corn crop that we purchase as a company. We have 5 plants in Indiana that produce just about 500 million gallons of ethanol on an annual basis. And each one of those plants produces between $200 to $300 million of economic impact in their local economy. So it really shows how important the ethanol industry is to the ag industry in Indiana, in the United States, and around the world. I'm just going to start out by saying that we talk often that we need to start getting our resources from the surface of the earth rather than the center of the earth. We've been taking coal and oil out of the center of the earth, processing it, putting it in the atmosphere for a long, long time. That creates an imbalance in nature. And, 200 years ago, we didn't have any oil. We got all of our resources from the surface of the earth 200 years ago. That's not that long ago, really. So the question is, can we get back to that? And what is ag's role in that? And I would say ag's role is critical. Ag's role going forward has 3 main functions. One, we've got to provide the resource or the food for a growing population. Number 2, we've got to provide the resources for an energy transition. And that's a really good thing for agriculture because it creates markets and margin, innovation, opportunity. And the third thing is we've got to do these 2 things all while reducing greenhouse gases and combating climate change. And agriculture can do all those things, and it will do all those things because innovation in agriculture is just starting. I mean, if you talk to the seed companies out there, we're just learning how to grow corn in this country, which is a phenomenal statement given the rise in yields that have been happening over the last several decades. But agriculture can provide all those things, and biofuels are a critical component to agriculture meeting its potential. I'll stop there with the introduction, and we'll get more into what we're doing from a carbon capture in the questions here.
Hello, everyone. Chris Malone from Indigo Ag. My colleague Dan Monjo was on a panel yesterday, so I won't say so much about us other than we're the largest MRV provider, so really carbon tech company in row crop agriculture. We're on over 7 million acres and helping farmers generate various carbon assets that are available today, such as offsets, insets, and voluntary markets, et cetera. My role is I lead market development as well as our biofuels offer for Indigo. We're very interested in what's happening in around decarbonization of transportation. That you have market mechanisms that originated on the West Coast, over a decade ago now, that have proven effective, where you score alternate fuels and you pay advantages based on reductions in carbon intensity. And I think they've been successful beyond their expectations, which is not usually what we're talking about in carbon markets. When you look at these fuels markets, most of the alternative fuels at this point are biofuels. Companies like Doug's are producing them, and a large part of their purported carbon footprint is from agriculture. And that has been an area that regulators have been slow to go to because it seems overwhelming, whereas you can kind of measure things in instruments at a single plant to suddenly look at thousands of farms and fields that supply it, is a big endeavor. And so, we look at that and try to show, look, like this isn't the world of 5 years ago. The technological breakthroughs around this area of agriculture have happened. You have your remote sensing models, farmer data management technologies that have taken off that do make this credible and viable. And I think once it is, the reason people get excited about it is because when you look at the cost of abatement, in transportation, you're really not going to find much of a better bang for your buck than going after the agricultural part. And we're starting to see markets move towards that, and we're just trying to be a voice showing best practices, showing very high standards in voluntary markets that industry has figured out how to meet, and help the regulated markets find their way.
Thank you for the introductions. Some quick stats. Just so, since we're in Indiana, just looked this up. So I believe 43% of Indiana's corn crop, so it's close to 2.5 million acres. It goes into ethanol production. And so if you think about that, Indiana produces just over 5 million acres of corn and soybeans each year. So, you've already got 43% into that as well. And so this is not part of the report, so I'm going to pause for a moment and turn to the audience. You're here. What about this topic? We've got some very smart folks. How much do you want to know about just the industry itself and how it works? How much about the science of it? And then the future opportunities with sustainable aviation? Just to, familiarity with just the whole marketing, the business model of ethanol and biofuel production. Anybody? A little more insight into that. So as we look at these questions, the science of possibilities of reduction and some of the terminology in low carbon intensive. Any show of hands on those? Okay. And then how about the future implications, that impact of sustainable aviation fuel and that? Fairly even. Okay. All right. So we can't start.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
For that introduction, I think this is something that people who are less familiar with, and I spend a lot of time talking to people that are less familiar with this area. The idea of corn going into ethanol is probably actually not a very good construct of how to think about it. People are like, well, 40%, 43%. Doug was explaining all the different products POET makes. Traditional, you would take raw corn and maybe feed it to an animal, cattle, let's say. An incredibly small percent of corn is going to humans to eat. What these plants really do is they break it down and they turn it into different products. Ethanol is not made of corn. It is made of corn starch. So it is just taking the starch part of the corn. Protein, oils, other things. Protein, by the way, is what's valuable to the animals. Those remain in the supply chain. So I think people are often kind of perplexed by this idea of where we're losing this corn to ethanol. Thinking about it as corn starch and really thinking about it as taking something and producing more value out of it than just serving a raw product is probably a better construct.
Thank you. Doug, any more?
I can just add to that a little bit that when we bring in corn, we do only make ethanol out of the starch. All the protein goes right back into the feed market, which it's grown for in the first place. And then the other third of that corn kernel is CO2. Right? Which is naturally sequestered from the sun in the spring and summer. I don't know if anybody is familiar with this, but the Midwest, where we grow corn and soybeans, is the largest natural carbon sink on planet Earth in the spring and summer. From all the corn, the soybeans, the wheat, the grass, everything is growing, sucking in carbon. from the atmosphere, and so we can easily capture that CO2 from fermentation that's already been captured by the corn kernel and sequester it and reduce carbon in our atmosphere. That's an exciting thing. The other thing about starch-based ethanol is that, can you imagine putting 43% of the corn crop in Indiana back on the farmers? What would the price of corn be? Who would be able to farm? Nobody could afford to farm. The ethanol industry started in large part because of a surplus of corn in the United States and around the world. If anybody remembers the mid to late 80s, we had a farm crisis. There was too much corn, too much soybean. The federal government was paying farmers not to farm 20% of their land. And it was, suicide rates were high in the Midwest. Bankruptcies were high. The ethanol industry came along and started building, and you can absolutely track farm incomes and land values with the growth of biofuels. So ethanol, biofuels in general, have balanced the markets for grain, created a margin in agriculture, which has created tremendous investment and innovation in agriculture, which we wouldn't have seen without the ethanol industry here. I'll point out one other thing, which I think is important. Since the ethanol began to really grow in about 2000, over 1 billion people worldwide have come out of extreme poverty. Because around the world, more than 50% of the residents of the world consider themselves to be farmers. So if the U.S. farmer can't afford to farm, how can the rest of the world afford to farm? We've got to create more markets, more biofuels from ag products to continue to balance the markets for grain so that agriculture is stable around the world.
Thank you.
Yeah. So in addition to the economic benefits that biofuels and a bioenergy-based industry can provide to, in agriculture, it is also a major way that we can decarbonize our energy sector and our economy in general, both by providing bioenergy that can displace fossil fuels, as well as by being able to sequester carbon. And here we're talking about biological carbon sequestration. In addition to, you could do the geological as well that we heard about earlier, or BECCS, but even sequestering carbon, and that's part of the carbon dioxide removal that can happen through the photosynthesis process. And one way that that is being incentivized is through, for example, the SAF tax credit, which is which makes corn and soybeans eligible for getting the SAF tax credit if they're produced using climate smart practices, or practices that sequester carbon in the soil, like cover crops or no-till or other such practices. And that really opens up a new opportunity for our crops in order to be able to become even more carbon friendly. And now this is a novel policy, because our current biofuel policies, including the low carbon fuel standard that we have in California, as well as the renewable fuel standard, do not explicitly differentiate the feedstock that is being produced, the method of producing the corn and soybeans or other feedstocks, based on their method of production, whether they were produced with cover crops or without, and what is the amount of carbon intensity of the production process, as well as the amount of soil carbon that was sequestered. So this opens up this new idea about having climate smart biofuels, becomes a new opportunity to reward farmers for doing those practices, as well as to make our biofuels even less carbon intensive. Now it's a great idea if it can be expanded beyond just sustainable aviation fuel to other biofuel policies. It really opens up the door to making the 40% of the corn that's going in more climate smart. Also, of course, raises a number of questions about how we would implement such a policy. What are the technologies to be able to do the MMRV at a fine scale? Do we need models or measurement? And the accuracy of those, which is certainly improving over time. but there's still a lot of variation in estimates across models and so on. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the amount of carbon sequestered, and so how do you account for that? And then the other thing that, it also, people have a lot of concern also about this new approach, which is that carbon that is sequestered in the ground, while a great opportunity, but is also not permanent. It can be reversed as farmers change practices from one to the other. So how do we account for that to make sure that we're actually getting a beneficial impact on global temperatures as we do this? So we can discuss that more if there's interest.
Thank you. And Jerome, before we turn to you, I just checked today. So I think corn prices today are just about $4.10 per bushel. And if you think about a year ago, it was around $5.75. So in a year, it's down 32%. Record production this fall. So the corn production in Indiana, I could be wrong, but it's going to be north of 180, close to 190 bushel per acre. But many farmers this year had corn still in storage because the prices had been dropping and they held on to it. And so you've got a record crop hitting storage that's still there, and corn that's still in storage. Soybeans, is 9.75, I think today. It was in May, that was $12. So you think about the impact of how farmers can market and sell that grain, and we talked about the technology and advancements, and we're just learning how to grow it, but we're hitting some yields and we have this opportunity. So turn now, Jerome, what does this do to the value of the land, and what do you do with that land with all of that? You use it to pour the corn on?
Okay, so that is a very good question, and I think it links back to what was said before about the economics, and also when you're thinking back about the farm crisis that Doug described before. So I mentioned before, I'm really interested in what happens to U.S. agriculture. I'm thinking about a long-term perspective. And if you're thinking about the current situation in the United States, is that you have record yields, okay, and you also have hit since a couple of years what is called the blend wall, in the sense that there's only so much corn ethanol that you can actually blend with gasoline. So on one side we have growing supply of corn, of other commodities. And then we also have for Indiana, you mentioned before, it's about 40%. Nationwide, it's about a third of corn that is produced for ethanol. So the question is, well, you are a farmer, and you now know that, well, the 1/3 of your demand is going to decline in the long run. So the question is, well, sustainable aviation fuels are one possibility to actually offset that decline in corn demand, but there are two problems. We don't really know when this is coming, the sustainable aviation fuels, and also corn is not necessarily the only feedstock that can be produced with, or that you can use to produce sustainable aviation fuels. Now, to come back to your question about what happens to farmland values. So I think about this as right now that we are basically at the crossroad where we are having new opportunities, sustainable aviation fuels. We are having the new opportunity of what I call carbon farming, or that farmers can actually sell carbon credits, and that theoretically should be all priced into the land. If you're thinking about that, the land value that we are currently seeing, I think it's about, I checked it out this morning, it's about $14,000 per acre for top-notch farmland in Indiana. So theoretically, if you now have the opportunity to use that farmland to carbon farm for sustainable aviation fuels, that theoretically should increase your value of Indiana farmland. I've been interested in farmland values, not necessarily in farmland values directly, but in what happens to land use for a very long time. And also when you're looking at the new agricultural census that came out a couple of months ago, that you actually have farmland coming out of production, if you will. Okay, you have a decline in farmland. And I think this is not necessarily you would see something somewhere in the Midwest because it's too productive, but you do have declining farmlands, I think, in the fringe region of the Corn Belt, if you will. So I think there's going to be a lot of I'm kind of excited because there's a lot of dynamics that are going to be important over the next couple of years or even decades with all those developments happening. And I'm really curious to also hear my fellow panel members of what they think about this.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think I agree with everything that Jerome just said. And one of the, additional elements to add there is this electrification of vehicles, which is likely to, the targets are to get to 50% of new cars being electric by 2030, and we still have a long way to go there. But if we were to get there, what would happen to demand for liquid fuel and so on? And but sort of one of the other areas that I work on, and I think that while certainly electrification offers, again, great opportunities to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, the transition is likely to be a bit slower than I think what optimistic projections are claiming it to be because of various reasons. I mean, infrastructure, and we can get into that, but cost of electric vehicles, concerns about range limitation and all of that. And even if we were to get to the so it's according at least to our model projections, it's going to take longer to get to the 50% cars being electric. But even if you get to that, then the turnover of fleet is going to mean that for a number of coming decades, we're going to still be having a lot of liquid fuel, cars on the road. So demand for ethanol is not going to decline that rapidly as might have been feared. But nevertheless, as we do make that transition, we want to be looking at other alternatives for using biofuel. There's and sustainable aviation offers a great opportunity to be able to do that for the hard to electrify sectors. The big challenge with sustainable aviation fuel is not so much, feedstock is one part of it, but is really the high cost of converting that fuel into sustainable aviation fuel. That's the really expensive part. And to make sustainable aviation fuels competitive with petroleum jet is a major challenge, technological challenge. So that's part of the issue. The other is that beyond in order to get to, so the goal with sustainable aviation fuels is they have to be at least 50% cleaner than petroleum jet, and hopefully get better than that. And so for corn, and of course you can do the geological sequestration that can get to the zero carbon, but again that is costly, and there are issues with that I'd love to hear more from Doug. But if we're looking at with just soil carbon sequestration and other ways to reduce carbon intensity, corn and soybean can perhaps get to that 50% target to be able to be eligible with the climate smart practices. But then we really need to go to these other cellulosic feedstocks, and corn stover offers an opportunity to do that. It can get you to a little bit more than 50%, but you have to be careful about the soil carbon effects. We've heard that in the previous panel, because if you start removing a lot of corn stover, it does have a negative effect on the soil carbon, even though it can provide overall a net benefit. But there's a trade-off between soil carbon and atmospheric carbon. But beyond that, then these dedicated energy crops, such as miscanthus, switchgrass, energy sorghum, energy cane, these are, have even greater potential to get to the 75-85% reduction in carbon intensity relative to petroleum jet. but they come with their own trade-off, which is a much higher cost that is involved in converting land and producing these types of perennials so then it also becomes a question of what are the policies that are going to be needed in addition to a target. We have this goal of getting to 35 billion gallons by 2050, but how do we actually make that happen? And do we need more blend mandate, or do we need tax credits? Would they be enough? Given the high gap right now between sustainable aviation fuel cost and petroleum jet, the current SAF tax credit is unlikely to be enough to make that viable. Let me stop there.
Talking a little bit about markets, the EVs make up about 8% of sales today, and I think that's going to continue. I think, like Madhu said, I don't think the EVs are coming as fast as most predictions have predicted. I think they will come, but they're going to be a lot slower. Efficiency standards have improved by about 35% in the last 20 years or so. I mean, think of that. That's 30% improvement in efficiency. That's stripping away the market share for ethanol and liquid fuels in general as well, which is a good thing. So what do we do with markets? Well, number one, ethanol makes up a little more than 10% of the U.S. fuel supply today, the gasoline pool in the United States. We want that to go to 15%, 20%. We can do that with the infrastructure that we currently have. Other countries are doing that. India just set a standard for 20% ethanol blend in the very near future, and they will not allow it to be made out of sugarcane, because if you make it out of sugarcane, you're actually consuming a food. They're going to mandate that everything is made out of corn in that country, because there you get food and fuel. Novel concept that we've been talking about for a long time. Brazil is a good example. Their current blend rate, minimum ethanol blend rate in the fuel, is 27.5%. That's the minimum amount of ethanol you can buy in gasoline. They also have 100% ethanol that you can buy. And they're moving their minimum blend rate to, I believe, 35% in the coming years. So my point is, the light-duty vehicle market has room to grow in the United States and around the world. Sustainable aviation fuel is obviously a huge market that we're looking at. It's got to be economically viable long term, and the government's going to come in and they're going to help kickstart that industry. Once we get up to volume, I think we can be much more competitive. The marine market is a very viable market for us. Marine fuels, they use what's called bunker oil today for the most part, and they're looking for an alternative fuel, and ethanol is a great fuel for them to look at. Maersk is now buying all dual fuel engines, and they're looking at methanol and ethanol as their feedstocks. And off-road is another market. I mean, we hear of diesel engines being converted to ethanol engines, whether it's tractors or semis or whatever it might be. So there's a lot of hope for ethanol as a molecule in different fuels. Ethanol as a molecule going into plastics is also a big potential. So there's a world of opportunity out there. We just need to make sure that the innovation and the economics are matching up, because the economics are critically important. People don't want to pay a lot more to fly somewhere just to be burning a cleaner fuel. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. So we've got a ways to go. There are a lot of markets out there, and even though our market in liquid fuels has been dwindling over years, we see the greatest potential we've ever seen in the biofuel sector right now.
If I could just add to a really important point that Doug just made, which is that, and we've sort of talked about this blend wall, and this blend wall is because our conventional vehicles, our typical vehicles, are only able to consume 10% currently, but we would need flex fuel vehicles to be able to consume the higher blends. And in part, flex fuel vehicles actually cost the same as as other vehicles. There's really no difference. It's not that they're more expensive. And a lot of flex fuel vehicles, the problem is that not that we don't have enough flex fuel vehicles, but that our flex fuel vehicles actually really have limited incentive to buy E85 even where it's available, because E85 is actually priced higher than E10, even though it is less energy content than E10. And the reason why we have much greater penetration of in Brazil and other places is because their E100 is priced at a very energy equivalent level to their E25, and the markets work in that way. And so this is another area where better pricing of E85 would in fact create incentives for more people to, at least the owners of flex fuel cars, to use them, and for more people who can, who are looking at cars to get flex fuel cars, because it costs pretty much the same as a regular car. So that's an artificial blend wall that is simply a market outcome and not a technological barrier.
So just a couple of comments to E85 and flex fuel vehicles. And this is something a colleague of mine told me anecdotally a couple of years ago. That so first of all, E85 vehicles, they were benefiting from, I think from like some sort of like credits under the previous CAFE standards, and those credits are not really there anymore, and hence for vehicle manufacturers, there's no incentive at this point to actually sell E85 vehicles, because they're not getting benefits from. And so what happened to this colleague is that they were doing a study at gas stations to ask, well, what is the awareness of flex fuel vehicles of customers. And he mentioned that there were cases where you have a person coming with their flex fuel vehicles, and they were asked the question, well, do you know what a flex fuel vehicle is? And they said no. Despite the fact that they were basically driving one, they were simply not made aware about E85. So that is one thing. So a lot of people also don't know that they can actually purchase E85. Second, and this is, I think, a little bit of my I would say my concern here. So you do have so those vehicles, E85 vehicles, they have to be produced by somebody. Right, and what we are seeing right now is that there is very little. There may be the demand for E85 for flex fuel, but we also have now all the car manufacturers that are actually basically focusing on electric vehicles, right? And so that the question is, well, maybe I, as a customer, maybe I wanted to purchase an E85 vehicle, but if nobody produces that E85 vehicle, then I'm out of luck, right? So there's also something to consider.
And I think there's just over 360 retail places in Indiana to buy the flex fuel, if I remember correctly. But yeah, Chris, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to answer the original question on the economics and land values. The value of land is based on far future, revenue streams, and so there hasn't really been much of a drawback in that value, despite very low commodity prices right now. And, I think they see, yes, price goes down, but it's production to continue to increase. Do we continue to get more markets? Like Doug was saying, it just went to cattle for corn. Now you take the parts that are not nutritious and make ethanol, you suddenly have two pieces of value for the exact same kernel. CO2 is maybe now a third, we vent it, so it's just wasted today if we monetize it. So I think they're looking at value and production and continuing to feel good about in the future. As far as people stopping farming, as an American, I hope not. This is a natural resource that we have, this arable land that can effectively mine the atmosphere and suck carbon and oxygen and nitrogen out of the atmosphere and give us things. So I think we should be very remiss to undo that as members of this country.
So we're going to stay with you. So the term low carbon intensity farming, crops, definition of that, and make sure that everybody understands. And we want to talk about where you see the biggest opportunities for innovation to impact the system. Innovation, technology, things like that.
Well, the big unlock that formed our company is I think people think of farming as a source of emissions. But when you grow a crop, you're sucking a vast amount of carbon out of the atmosphere. Like corn, for example, is exceptionally good at this. This is why we grow so much corn. It uses a unique form of photosynthesis. You can see it. Like you walk up to where there was nothing and there's this huge expanse of biomass that's mostly made of carbon, and that all came from the atmosphere. And there's, in the order of about 10 tons of carbon per acre of a, full dry corn plant. And so we say, wow, how do you store some of that on Earth as removals? And I think people, CCS panels on before, that has been exciting to people. Wow, there's so much CO2. That is just in the kernel on that plant, just the kernel. There's generally one ear of corn. The kernels of that ear are sequestering huge amount of biogenic carbon. Imagine if you worked on the roots and the stalks and the leaves and the cobs. And we want to return that to soils. We can both store it in soils and improve soil health, so that's a win-win. But there are other ways to supercharge that and use all that biogenic carbon to get very, very, very negative CI crops, and that's what drives us.
I want to comment on a couple of things. So we filed a waiver for E15 with the EPA a number of years ago. And when the DOE and EPA did all their studies on E15 and compatibility with cars, they also did E20. And they found no discernible difference between E10, E15, and E20 in the performance of our cars. So I would argue that we could go to at least 20% in non-flex fuel vehicles. Now, the EPA a number of years ago, I think in the Tier 3 rule, changed the math on E85 and penalized car manufacturers from making flex fuel vehicles. That's what happened. I would argue that was a completely political move to make the electric vehicle more competitive, because we were building a bridge to all levels of ethanol in this country with flex fuel vehicles, but someone didn't want that to happen. And I'll just say it, the oil companies have a tremendous amount of control in what happens at EPA and through the federal government. Every gallon of ethanol we sell is a gallon of gasoline the oil industry doesn't sell. Whether it's better for the planet, better for human health, better for our environment, our economy, you name it, we are taking market share from the most powerful political force on the planet, and they've cast doubt in the minds of the American consumer of what the value of ethanol is. And we are tremendously undervalued right now. If we had a free market for fuels in this country, I would argue we'd be at 20% of the US fuel market today, at least. And I think that's where we need to go. One other thing, you mentioned the price of corn today at what, $4.15? The national average, according to USDA, break-even price is $4.80 a bushel. And we're selling it for $4.15 a bushel. That means we're going to have to get back to subsidizing agriculture if we don't grow our markets for corn.
You mentioned, so in the process, and look, on today's the Agri-News feed, the couple of things that came up, the Biden administration announced a $3 billion fund to fund renewable energy in rural America. The next headline was aggregator hesitation. Meaning because of the uncertainty of U.S. policy in this space, big companies like Cargill and Bunge are slowing the buying of soybeans for fuel. And so when there's lots of things at work here that impact the farmers and what they can do with this, and when the system slows up, I'm going to toss that out there. This is a nonpartisan panel, but the influence of things like that on market and what, from a researcher standpoint, you've got sound science and then things like that happen. And when it was sustainable aviation fuel, the aviation companies are going to want a target out there. But then how long does it take to hit that target before their shareholders are happy and things like that? So a whole lot there, but I'll toss it out. You guys have been good about taking these.
Part of that is, California is, they're voting on this on November 8th, but looking at putting a cap on how much of the renewable diesel you produce from crop-based oils can go to their state. And to date, about 3 billion gallons of renewable diesel go to that state. So it's, the majority of the use in the United States. So I think that's right now what has caused this big concern about, that potentially taking, 1 billion gallons of oil, out of the market, and has people, kind of wondering how that will kind of reverberate through the system.
I'm going to throw something out. I think this is a really important aspect, global agriculture. You mentioned record corn crop. We produced 177 bushels per acre national average last year, the largest corn crop in history. This year we're going to produce north of 183 bushels per acre, national average. Now, and we're producing grain, we're selling grain for less than what it costs to produce. Let me just throw out the global stat for you. Globally, if you take the United States out of the equation, the average corn yield per country is 59 bushels per acre. 59. We're producing over 180 national average. Now, what does that mean? That means that there is untapped potential worldwide. We built a blueprint in the United States in the Midwest that we could plant in Africa, in India, in China. Agricultural products need more markets because markets lead to margin. Margin leads to investment, and investment leads to innovation. That's what helps us get to achieve the potential of agriculture around the world. And just imagine if we put 200 ethanol plants in Africa right now to supply the marine industry, for example. Just think of the agricultural and economic activity that it would fundamentally change Africa forever. Agriculture is the backbone of the economy of the world, and we are not using it. We're not managing agriculture properly today. We need to manage agriculture better to meet its potential and to improve the world.
We'll let each of you finish, and then we'll go to audience for questions.
Yeah. As we think about a transition from our current conventional agriculture, conventional vehicles, and cheap oil, we need to have policy to bridge the gap between current costs and costs of new technologies. And that's where the government plays a huge role. But the challenge with the government policies is that it creates these cycles of hype and depression, because so with going back to the renewable fuel standard, which really created this hype about biofuels and the role that it could play, getting to 36 billion gallons that we should have achieved by 2022. And then, as the technology became expensive and we had a lot of pushback from big oil and all of that, we backed away from that. And now we're on this thing of, well, we should have sustainable aviation fuels and electrification. And by the government picking these technology winners, it really really disrupts the possibilities that exist. For example, the switch away now from where we could have exploited this potential for flex fuel cars and had, we need a portfolio approach rather than picking a single technology winner as the way to go. We really need a mix of approaches in order to be able to get to our low carbon, targets. So that's sort of one issue that I think causes a lot of disruption, where you have investment starting and then it's not, the mandates and the policies are not maintained long enough for that to mature and for the technology to mature to get to the point. If we look back at the corn ethanol industry, we've been trying to produce corn ethanol way back since the 70s. And it took a long time for corn ethanol to become competitive with gasoline, where you get to a point where you don't even really need the mandate. And we've overshot the mandate in many years because of that. So it takes a very long commitment. And in order for industry to invest in these kinds of high cost disruptive technologies, and if we don't maintain that, then we're just sort of not very effective in the way that we're using our policy. Just wanted to very quickly get to your original question, which is what are the innovations that we can do to get to more carbon benefits? And one of the things to recognize about agriculture is that compared to the amount of soil carbon that we had in the Midwest prairies in the 1800s, we're about like 50% of that now because of intensive tillage practices. And now there's sort of increasing recognition about regenerative agriculture and how we need to replenish the soil through better practices like cover crops, no-till, biochar, and all of that. So there's significant potential to be able to do that on the millions of acres of land that we have under our current crops, and then to transition to these other crops like energy crops and so on that can sequester, 3 to 4 times what you can get with corn and soybeans because they have deeper roots and they're perennials and so on. So again, we need a mix of conventional crops for our food and feed, and then energy crops for meeting our energy needs, and the right policies to incentivize that mix.
And just some of the newer technologies that are coming, I think people are atrophied on cover crops and no-till. There's AMF technologies, which are these mycorrhizal fungi that can be produced to basically make use of a lot more of that carbon. They're sequestering in tests, around 2 tons per acre. You do that right there, you got very negative CI corn and other crops. You have enhanced rock weathering, where people are replacing lime that's applied to fields and using olivine or basalt. These have negative priming characteristics. They suck down about a ton of carbon per acre, just basically using that land and replacing an existing application that you're using for pH adjustment. So there's there's new technologies coming online now that there's a market that, I always say that cover cropping and no-till is going to be like the sticks and stones era of regenerative agriculture. We have a huge amount of carbon to work with, a huge amount of managed lands to work with. We should be sucking down many, many, many tons of carbon a year doing it right.
Just to follow up on something that Doug said about the potential in the productivity in the United States. So a couple of years ago, there was a scientific paper that was more of a thought experiment, and they looked at, if you're looking at water quality, biodiversity, carbon storage, or carbon emissions, where should you be producing food for the world? And they actually found out that one of the best places to grow food with a very low environmental impact is the U.S. Midwest. So that is basically that we really have to recognize that U.S. agriculture is tremendously productive. I also would like to go on the second point about the potential in other countries, that basically the U.S. can be a blueprint for other countries. Now, just a little bit of a caveat there. So there's a concept about what are called yield gaps, in the sense that you have around the world you have regions that are not at their potential, and that is fine. That you have this desire to increase the yields, to increase food production, but just to keep in mind that if you're increasing production, supply and demand is not going to increase, then your prices are going to drop. Which has been a concern in recent years, as was mentioned before.
Thanks.
Can I just point out one more thing on Africa really quick, and then I'll be done. We have a philanthropy arm called Seeds of Change, and we're working on agriculture in Kenya, for example. In Kenya, when they plant corn, they have typically put 4, 5, 6 seeds in one hole, and those seeds cannibalize each other. And they're not getting through the hard pan of the soil, so their roots can't go down and find the moisture. What we've done is come in with some modern agricultural practices, and in 2 growing seasons, we see 5 to 9x the amount of yield. 5 to 9 times the yield improvement in Africa. And so it is very possible, but they are farming to survive. We farm to thrive. There's a big difference, and modern ag practices in a lot of places around the world can totally transform agriculture around the world. I'd just say that.
So, questions? We covered a lot here. Got 3 up front here. We'll go right down the row.
So we've talked a lot about carbon. I talked a lot about carbon. I feel like the elephant in the room is often nitrogen and phosphorus. We could keep going, but let's just talk about nitrogen. The corn is 2.5% nitrogen. I'm not aware of any corn systems in the US that are being grown without fertilizer. That fertilizer has a big equivalent of CO2 hit from just the Haber-Bosch process. And then another hit because we get a lot of nitrous oxide emissions in most situations. I recognize that the circular economy of feeding that distillate back to a cow, that is certainly mitigating some of that. That's keeping that nitrogen, that protein in use and a productive use. But when we think about the alternative of a corn-based system, which you've just made a strong argument for, several of you have, versus a bioenergy crop like switchgrass, which can be grown, at least on some marginal soils, with very, very low inputs, or even no inorganic fertilizers. How do we weigh those intangible benefits of ecosystem health, of nitrogen, and some of them are not intangible. They're actually, we can measure the nitrous oxide and then the energy cost to make those inorganic fertilizers. So I guess I'm asking this of the economists, but really any of you, I would love to hear your thoughts.
I would just say first that there are actually corn. There are types of corn that can fix their own nitrogen, so that does exist. It's used a little bit in North Dakota and Puerto Rico, but there is some out there. It's kind of this, but very rare. But yeah, so it's you attack both sides. So on the production side, one area where you're seeing 45Q go is into these ammonia plants where they're capturing and sequestering the CO2. And so that reduces the carbon intensity of the ammonia production by about 70% in reality, but when you apply it, usually people use very negative, very conservative assumptions about everything. So you end up seeing more like a 90% improvement relative to kind of a standard emissions factors that are out there. So that's something we're very excited about. CF Industries is going to have a huge amount of this coming on next year, as are others. And then if you can use 45V, there's potentially a path to green ammonia as well that would get it all the way to about zero. So that's how the front end of the embedded emissions are being attacked right now, which is, that's great. Like it's the business case there is excellent. I mean, the blue ammonia, there's some CapEx, but the operating cost difference is zero. And then on the other side, what do you do about the nitrous oxide emissions? Some of that is around practices, of course. There's things you can do to reduce, the volatilization. No matter what, you're going to have denitrification. And then there are products such as Inserv and others that can help reduce that. And so, we're seeing that be used to make about a 40 to 50% reduction in nitrous oxide emissions. So if you use the blue or green ammonia, you take out the embedded emissions, you use a product to maybe cut in half the nitrous oxide emissions, suddenly you've attacked, about 80% of that problem. And so that's what we see in the short term, and maybe carbon fixing corn is something in the further into the future, or nitrogen fixing, sorry.
Yeah, farming is not perfect today, but it's getting a lot better all the time. And in our process, we actually see a path toward bio-based fertilizers. That can be done. Biochar was mentioned in the last group, and I think you're going to see a lot more of that. If you drive through Iowa today, you see a lot of manure being spread over fields today. So farmers are really working hard on reducing nitrogen and all those different types of things. So it's coming. It might not be coming as fast as we want it, but farmers are definitely taking better care of their soil, better care of the environment, and all that through climate smart practices. And I think that's just going to continue to get better.
I hate to pause, but I think with spreading manure, we're going to pause for lunch and finish the panel. No, but please give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. Yeah. So, leave lunch out, pick up outside, and eat anywhere you want. Find a new friend. Ask some questions. The panelists are here. Please enjoy lunch right outside the door.